given the news, I think probably everyone around the country, just about everyone around the country knows by now that LA City Council on Wednesday passed an ordinance that puts 800,000 workers in LA on the pathway to get $15 an hour. Even before it passed, the editors on the New York Times wrote an editorial calling it a bombshell. And then Fortune magazine, also before the ordinance was passed, wrote an article focusing on this movement and using that as a way to talk about which cities needed $15 the most. Here you have a magazine that honors and cherishes millionaires and billionaires and puts them in the list for everybody to gawk at, talking about what low-wage workers need. What would force newspapers of the ruling class to talk about $15 an hour as if it's an imminent thing to happen? What would force them to talk about it in a way that $15 an hour is the accepted figure that everybody should have, as opposed to some other figure? So we're going to talk about that today. Just on Wednesday, this just today, the New York governor issued an order appointing people to a fast food wage board. And he did that in the wake of the LA vote for $15 an hour. So what would force the New York governor, who is an anti-union governor, who is so anti-union that the AFL-CIO did not support him in his last campaign, the AFL-CIO being sort of the captive of the Democratic Party. They didn't even endorse him in his last election campaign because he'd been slashing pensions for state workers in New York. He's been making cutbacks in health care. He froze wages for years and years. He cut funding for schools across the state of New York, and he was for extending the millionaire tax. So why would this guy be appointing a board for fast food workers, hundreds of thousands of fast food workers in New York, so that they could get a raise? It certainly wasn't the pressure that he's getting from the CEOs of McDonald's or Burger King. They average $26 million a year in their salary versus people who work for them getting an average of $17,000 if they can get the hours to work. In addition to this political question about what's changed the dynamic here, what's forced these ruling class entities to see $15 an hour as the reasonable thing to be talking about, there are other things that we should also be thinking about as we look at this. Should we be talking about the struggle for just getting a contract in a particular company to get $15 an hour, or should it be a broader citywide or statewide effort to get $15 an hour in a broader political arena? And should we be talking, there are also elements in this discussion about what the internal relationships were in the movement to gain $15 an hour. What were the relationships between the community groups and the labor groups? What were the relationships within labor between those who were pushing for this and those who were holding back and resisting it? So all those things are important to talk about, and I hope we can do that as we begin to describe what went on. But without any doubt, anybody who is in those hearings, and particularly anybody who is in the last stages of this struggle in LA, could see in the cheers of the people as the vote was taken, and in the smiles on their faces, the tears in their eyes, that this meant something to them. They had struggled for so long. They had wanted this and needed this so desperately for so long, and now they were finally getting an element of what they needed, and they were so happy to see it because they knew it was going to make a difference in their lives. For months they had been involved in marches and in press conferences and in rallies and in sit-downs and in strikes and in hunger strikes also to raise this pressure. And that pressure created the vote that took place, and in essence the city council was simply ratifying something that was essentially won in the streets and in the struggle. So movements in many cities are looking at this. Movements in many cities are seeing that, okay, this has been won, and now they can use this as an example to jump off and organize more. And already in Long Beach and already in Pasadena and other cities in Southern California, there are movements to get, we're already on the way to get $15 an hour there. The difference between this struggle, one of the reasons that the LA vote is so important, is that it covers 800,000 people. 800,000 people. So there have been important developments in the movement for $15 an hour in Seattle and SeaTac and other places that have gotten $15 an hour. but this covers more workers than anywhere else. And 800,000 people is more than the entire population of Boston, it's more than the entire population of Baltimore, it's more than the entire population of Seattle. It's a huge number. It's the low-wage capital of the world. It's also the wage theft capital of the world. And making it happen there against the forces of big business that really run that city and run the entire Southern California meant something. So this struggle won $15 an hour, but it's not, as somebody was pointing out earlier, it's not $15 right now. In fact, right now it's going to be remaining at $9. Next year it goes up to $10.50, and then in stages it goes up to $15 beginning in 2020. Or if the employer has less than 26 workers, then it goes the following year, so the 1 year delay. So there's a stages in getting to the 15, but it's getting to the 15. And in this struggle, it's not just the wages that were won, but also wage theft was addressed. And wage theft is a huge issue in LA as it is around the country. People not being paid for overtime at time and a half. People not being paid for breaks that they're supposed to be paid for in terms of paid breaks. Even more often, people not being paid the minimum wage that they're supposed to be getting. There's $9 an hour and people getting less than that. So there are many different ways of people having their wages stolen. Tip workers experience a lot of wage theft in terms of not getting the tips that are supposed to be getting to them. So, and when they have taken, there's a process in California for appealing wage theft issues, and people who do make those claims, win about 85 to 95% of the time. But less than 2 or 3% of the time do they actually see anything out of that. And they never see the entire amount that has been ordered. And retaliation has always been a fact of life there. So that it was legal before this ordinance was passed, and the vote actually there's one more vote that needs to be taken. It's legal for someone to be fired for simply questioning whether or not wage theft has took place before they file a claim. After they file a claim, there's a little bit more protection, but beforehand, it's legal to fire them. And the level of retaliation is also reflected in the fact that people who file wage claims, people who make a statement to a board saying that I'm misclassified as an independent contractor, I'm really a full-time employee, I really deserve this, have been sued, countersued by their employers. So that then they just for trying to stand up for the rights, then they have to try to figure out, well, how am I going to pay, how am I going to deal with this, how am I going to get a lawyer, how am I going to do all that other stuff that requires organization and funds. So, so wage theft was a huge factor in this, and getting a process in place, getting a board that's going to investigate wage theft claims, trying to get penalties that would include criminal penalties for this, trying to get penalties that would make them put the money up front when there was a ruling against them, so that they wouldn't be screwed when the employer changed its name or just left or tried to do nothing. So there were significant gains, and the criminal penalties issue is still being talked about, but there are significant gains in what was already put into place there. In addition to that, this new set of policies also includes a thing that's hard fought in terms of getting discrimination incorporated into the wage theft claim system. So that there's the Black Workers Center was key in pressing and bringing this issue up and forcing it, and everybody else was getting on board and pushing it as well, to show that there is a deep connection between wage theft and racism, a deep connection between wage theft and racism against Black and Latin and Asian workers, and a deep connection between wage theft and sexism, tip workers being almost all women, for example, and that was brought up very eloquently in all the hearings. In fact, when you go to LA, you see that the tremendous the tremendous Black population in the city, but about 3% of the construction jobs are held by African Americans there. And the same is true in garment industry. So there are whole industries that black workers are excluded from. So talking about a minimum wage was said to be not enough. We have to talk about access to jobs so we can get a wage, number one. So getting a wage was one thing. Getting wage enforcement, because you can have a wage that is $30 an hour, but if people aren't being paid, you don't have an enforcement mechanism, it doesn't mean anything. The same thing with getting in the door. All these things, these components of this struggle were put together. And you can imagine that there were differences. There were some people who just wanted to focus on wages. Some people said, I want to get in the door, I want to focus on racism. Other people said, I want to focus on paid sick leave. Other people said, wage theft is what we got to do. Holding that coalition together, making everybody see their common interests was a part of this process, and it, frankly, it doesn't magically happen or wonderfully happen. It happens sometimes with bumps in the road. But it did happen. And it happened to the extent that these concessions were won. So it's easy, I think, for everybody in this room to figure out what the shortcomings were. First of all, $15 an hour. I think you pointed out, $15 an hour was not going to happen until 2020, right? So that's an obvious shortcoming. And $15 an hour itself is not enough to live in LA. Even the most liberal studies say that you need $33 an hour to be able to afford an apartment in LA. LA is one of the most expensive cities in the country. So it's not good from that point of view. It's not as good as other laws in terms of, that have incorporated paid sick leave requirements and other elements in that. So a lot of people, even people who are well-meaning and came into the coalition at the last minute and said, I want $15 an hour now. Well, who doesn't want $15 an hour now? The question was what was going to be able to be won at that particular moment in the struggle based on the relationship of forces at the time. And I think what is important for us is not the number, which should always be higher, and it should always embrace more people. The importance for us is that this was a struggle that embraced lots of people in the city, lots of poor and working people in the city, and made a demand through organizing and through creating power, forced them to come up with this concession. A year ago, people didn't think this was possible at all. They were carving out, and did carve out, hotel workers by LAX, which got a raise to $15.37 beginning July 1st this year. They carved out another segment of workers in another area, but this citywide effort was unprecedented and also thought to be an impossible task. So the dynamics of in this struggle included holding this coalition together, as we talked about, and it talked about the need to not just fight racism, at the same time you're fighting for a wage increase, but also to create the unity that's needed to go against the boss. So the boss, on the other side of this dynamic, they were saying, well, first of all, you've got to study this for another few years. Then you have to get concrete economic information about who's paying what. Then you have to stretch out any raise that's going to happen for 10 to 20 years, what they said. Plus you need to pay young people 20 years and below less money. Plus you need to pay prisoners and homeless people in transitional programs less money because, frankly, they're valued less. And you need to pay people in nonprofits, people doing good work, you have to give them low wages. So those were the arguments that they had, and they wanted to say at the same time that you're going to be destroying jobs. That's the typical thing that's said at that time. And it was the restaurant industry in particular, the workers there were very good at showing that the industry is expanding and that this idea about job loss is phony, and there are other responses to that. But on our side, it was really, frankly, wonderful to see that on one hand you had them, and on the other.
Oh no.
Okay.
Sorry.
You have the boss on the other side, and on our side there were undocumented port truck drivers who were joining with our Walmart workers, who were joining with garment workers, who were joining with janitors, who were joining with car wash workers, warehouse workers, people who are working in beauty salons, people working in nail salons, all those people whose labor is invisible, but whose labor is so essential to the functioning of this system. They were lifted up in this struggle. They were the ones that were the speakers at the rallies. They were the ones who were the speakers at the press conferences. They were the ones who were organizing their co-workers and their neighbors to be in part of this struggle. And it's those people who really were at the core of this movement. But in addition to that core in the movement, though, it can't be forgotten that this movement would not have been successful if it wasn't for the organizational support of SEIU and the AFL-CIO. It took money, it took organizers, it took all kinds of press expertise, it took all kinds of other things to make this happen and make it happen at this particular moment. There are many in the movement, I think, who sometimes think that, well, the unions, because they're so reactionary on so many things, or they've been so conservative or so silent or so dead on so many things, or they're not involved in the anti-police brutality stuff, well, they're worthless, and we should go create our own unions or our own small little things, and maybe we can get by that way. Well, frankly, it wouldn't happen. This would not have happened if it hadn't been for that organizational support that was happening at the same time. So there are groups of people who are not included in this because they're not covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act, they're not covered by the California minimum wage laws either. And one of those groups, for example, are long-term care workers. There are 140,000 long-term care workers who take care of the elderly poor in LA County, 160,000 elderly poor, and also disabled people. They do it in their homes, and they don't qualify for any of the wage and hour laws, right? For overtime, for minimum wage, for any of that stuff. But yet they were a component. They weren't going to directly gain by this, but they knew that by this struggle happening, that their prospects were lifted up by that, and lifted up to the extent that they're probably going to get that raise next few weeks in terms of demands that are being made at the county level there. But the issue of raising a wage, you know, either whether it's on at an individual company or on a broader scale, is something that has been at the core of the system of exploitation for a long time, the core of what everybody wants and needs and desires, and has been a part of the labor struggle. You know, in the early 1800s, about 1803 to 1805, there were there were a number of unions that were being developed. And it was in that period of time that court decisions were issued that said that that unions were an illegal conspiracy to try to raise the wage. You know, they were trying to limit exploitation, and they were trying to do it in many different ways. To tie it to the postal worker that thought of this, that it was exactly the same time, or within a few years, like 1803, the postal workers, by law, said that they could only be white, because the letter carriers were seen as being, black letter carriers were seen as spreading the revolutionary word. So it was the same time that they said that all workers were going to be repressed, that the unions were illegal conspiracies. Despite that, in the 1820s and 1830s, there developed citywide coalitions of lots of unions, all illegal unions at that point, and they demanded citywide political demand. They made political demands for public education, political demands for raising the wage for everybody, political demands that were showing the interests of all workers. And that, I think, obviously in 1938, when FDR finally signed that law for the Fair Labor Standards Act, the anniversary of which is coming up in a couple of weeks, that was the result of a huge struggle in the 1930s, preceded by other huge struggles prior to that, that forced that concession of the Fair Labor Standards Act. The point being that every one of these laws for a higher minimum wage, in 1938, or all the successive amendments to that raised the national minimum wage, and all the statewide struggles that have tried to raise the wage above the minimum, all of those are directed to the system of exploitation. All of them are directed to how much surplus value is the boss going to be getting. All of them are directed to the fact that people can't afford to live, and they're being pressed down to the bare minimum of what it takes to survive, and they're trying to lift themselves up. So it's in that struggle that you know, at the very core of all those things that we're about, of creating real power and overcoming this system, that is at the center of this struggle for raising the minimum wage in $15 an hour in LA, or $15 an hour in New York, or $15 an hour in Washington, D.C. This is really a new movement that's been developed. It's been developing now for some time, particularly since the Occupy movement, well, actually no, since 2006, when the general strike of immigrant workers sort of shut down all the major metropolitan areas, and unfortunately did not get the support of the labor movement at that time. But that general strike catapulted a lot of things in the movement, and that was followed by the Occupy movement popularizing the slogan of 1%, exposing the system of injustice on an economic and social level. And now we see a lot of organizing that's going on. Undocumented port truck drivers going on strike repeatedly, demanding a union, demanding the classification as a real employee, number one, and 14,000 of these workers are doing this, and demanding a union, and winning. They've had a number of wins in that struggle. There are, it's not just there. I mean, in Minneapolis, that janitors are organizing and have won. They forced Target, for example, to recognize their joint employer relationship with they subcontracted these low-wage companies to do the janitorial work in the stores after hours, and so those workers were being paid nothing and being treated like nothing, and they were able to organize and force Target to agree to a process for unionization, a process for health and safety, a process for all kinds of things to lift up their dignity. They're winning. And that shows that things are happening everywhere, not just in LA, not just in Minneapolis, but in lots of places across the country. It's happening with our Walmart. It's happening with the struggle for 15. The struggle for 15 is not just on at these citywide areas, but it also is happening at McDonald's and fast food industry in general, which is another movement that's essentially organized and spearheaded and financed by SEIU. And it's really gaining power. Gaining power is reflected by what's happening in New York in terms of this wage board. They got off the hook in LA in terms of they could pay the $15 an hour right now, but still they're under pressure. It's interesting that all these forces of big business, the Chamber of Commerce and everybody else, gets up there and says, our workers, we can't afford to do 15, but McDonald's and these other large companies, Walmart, for example, didn't come and speak. They prefer to go around the back door and talk to politicians to get their dirty work done that way. And it'd be laughable for them to say that they can't afford something, when obviously they can. But this is, again, this is a movement that gives great hope. That I think Radhika talked about, that it used to be nothing happening, essentially. And now a lot is happening. And I think that for all of us who believe who want to change this system as a whole, we should remember that all those people who have been thinking about the same thing. Marx, when he wrote the Communist Manifesto, for example, talked about the immediate aims, being involved with a struggle over the immediate aims of the workers as they have them now, and connecting it to the larger struggle. Lenin talked about that in 1920 when he wrote the Left-Wing Communism and Total Disorder. That was a time after the revolution, right? So he knew something about making a revolution. He had lived through a lot of stuff, right? And the experiences that they had showed them that, yes, you've got to be involved in the struggle. And the same thing, Trotsky talked about the transitional demands, etc. But much more important than the names of the people and quoting stuff like that is the historical experience. If we believe that we want the working class to have power, then this is a struggle where the workers are struggling against exploitation on a citywide basis after others. We need to find a way to be involved in that struggle, to be with them, because the more they see, the more they're involved in that struggle, they see, especially citywide struggles, they see the system as a whole. They see the bosses on the other side, not just their individual boss, they see the Chamber of Commerce, they see the Restaurant Association, they see the whole system being against them. And they see the whole labor movement being with them, to the extent the labor movement is with them. We can talk about that in the question and answer. But they see a lot of that. And it gives everybody hope. And it not only gives them hope, but it opens their eyes to what's possible. It opens their eyes to what is possible in terms of their own strength. It opens their eyes to what the other side is, but also what they can achieve. Through organization and through struggle, they can achieve much more power. Thank you.